Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So, as part of our Tuesday talk series, we're keen at exploring and hopefully finding the answer to a burning question we've had as a gallery for many number of years now. And that's, how do we go about building a sustainable market for VR artworks? What are the implications, challenges involved in that, and how do we tackle them? Sorry, I'm completely out of breath. To help me answer these questions once and for all, we have a fantastic, great panel here. Michael, I'll start with you. So Michael Takeo Magruder, exhibiting artist and former Gazelli resident, has been working with new media over the last 20 years, comprising of real-time data, digital archives, immersive environments, and virtual worlds. With over 290 exhibitions in 35 countries under his belt, he showed at institutions such as the Courtauld Institute of Art, FACT in Liverpool, Pompidou Center in Paris, Namjoon Pike Art Center in Seoul, Quad in Derby, Somerset House in London, Tokyo Metropolitan Museum, to name a few. His works were commissioned by Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, Arts Council England, the EU Cultural Programme, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, amongst others. In 2010, Michael was selected to represent UK at Manifesta 8, the European Biennale of Contemporary Art, and in 2015 was awarded the Immersive Environments Lumen Prize for his virtual reality installation in New Jerusalem, which we had the pleasure actually of showing at the Enter Through the Headset 3 last year, being the piece he had up on our online residency. From 2016, Michael was artist in residence at the British Library, undertaking an arts research project entitled Imaginary Cities, part of which is on display here, over there, which examines the digital map archives of the library's 1 million images from the scanned book collection, which I hope you're going to tell us shortly about. Allegra Shorto, over there, at the far end, is art director of Khora Contemporary and is based between London and Copenhagen. Her focus is on establishing virtual reality as a widely applied medium within the arts, focusing on collaborations with artists and institutions involving new digital technologies. Allegra has a background in contemporary art curation and holds an MA degree in history of art from the University of Cambridge. Khora Contemporary was found in 2017, I believe?
2016, yeah.
16. 17, I guess you did the launch at the Venice Biennale, right? So 2016, to bridge the gap between artists and virtual reality developers. Their inaugural project was launched during the Venice Biennale of 2017 with commissioned works by Paul McCarthy and Christian Lemmertz. Works created with the support of Khora Contemporary by artists Eric Parker, Tony Ausler, Nikita Shalini, and Yu Hong, who we've been just talking about, have been shown in various places, including Museum of Old and New Art in Tasmania, Mona, Geneva International Film Festival, Focus Festival in Copenhagen, Art Basel, and most recently at the I Film Museum in Amsterdam. Correct? Ish. And now Dr. Sylvia, on my right, Xueni Pan, is a lecturer in virtual reality in the Department of Computing at Goldsmiths University, working in VR for more than 10 years. She developed a unique interdisciplinary research profile with journal and conference publications in both VR technology and social neuroscience. With a degree in computer science, a master's in vision, imaging, and virtual environments, and a PhD in virtual reality. I don't know how you did that, this whole thing. Sylvia worked as a research associate in computer science at UCL from 2009 until 2013, before joining Goldsmiths in 2015. Over the years, she was involved in projects such as exploring the benefits of 3D avatars and ethical challenges within the humdrum of professional practice, the research into how we subconsciously copy each other using virtual reality, and also how we make moral judgments and whether they are aligned with our moral action in virtual reality. Sylvia's work in training and education in VR has been featured multiple times in the media, including BBC Horizon and New Scientist magazine. So to give a quick background, do we have the presentation up already running? Yeah, okay, so you'll see the galleries, yeah. So you'll see a few images of the shows we've done. So to give a bit of background about these Enter Through the Headset exhibitions we've been hosting for the past 4 years now. In October 2015, we launched Gazelli Art, which is the first online residency of its kind that is affiliated to a physical gallery space for artists working in digital medium. On a monthly basis, artists get invited to take complete creative control of the domain and upload as much or as little content as they like within the allocated period of time. Initially, the model was built on selecting a work or two from the uploads and making it available as a print on our online shop for a value agreed with the artist. And that model didn't, we tried it for about a year, and that model didn't quite work for us. The number of inquiries were low, the sales were even lower. So we've decided to revamp the residency and only focus on artists working in VR or feature VR-only works on the platform. So the following year in 2016, we put together our first Enter Through the Headset show, which featured 3 of the previous residents of Gazelli Art. The residency has opened doors to a pool of artists, 43, including this month's resident, all working with the medium, 7 of which we'll hopefully be working with in closer capacity, Michael including. So to date, we've sold a tiny number of works, something that I'm not very proud of. But the sales we've made to both institutions and private collectors are more importantly, the conversations we've had. I hope you don't mind me reading this because I kind of tend to focus when I read, so bear with me. But more importantly, the conversations we've had over the past few years within the context of a commercial gallery, the conversations with the artists, with the collectors, to be honest, even with the walk-ins, has led us to believe that the medium is not going anywhere. And if anything, we need to be proactive as a gallery in building a market for it. So what we'll do, what I suggest we do is obviously we'll kick off, I think, Michael, you first, and then Allegra, and then Sylvia, into kind of these 3 5-minute presentations of how you came about to work within this space, work within this medium, and then we'll dive into how do we go about building a market for VR works. Sounds good?
Sounds good.
Great. Go for it.
All right. Yes, if you could pull my PDF up, please.
Do you want to switch places?
Yeah, that might actually work a little bit better. All right, thanks, Mila. It's nice to be here. And I hope everyone can see, since I know you're not going to be able to read what's on the screen, I'll just kind of say it out. So just a little bit about myself. Really, for the last 25 years, everything that I've produced uses some kind of digital technology, digital system, networks, code, live data. And of course, VR has always been a big part of that. I have been working in VR for over 20-some years, doing things online, using old school stuff like VRML, virtual reality modeling language, in combination with stuff like Java and Flash. We're working in sort of new emerging environments like Second Life and Open Simulator. But for all the stuff that has actually existed on the screen, I've always been interested in getting it off the screen. So whether you can see this black box sort of spaces or hybrid performance spaces, like this piece I did at Hellerau, architectural sort of historical spaces, or of course, a nice white cube environment like here we have at Gazelli. And for me, it's always been this exploration of how do I sort of work within these traditional spaces for visual arts practice, but bring in the kind of the new 3D and VR technology. So that's something that I've explored over the last 20 years. And my roots in this is I have no arts background. I come from a hardcore sort of science and tech environment. When everyone else was having the sort of, oh, what's better, Mac versus PC, well, I was working on an SGI at the time. So that kind of sets the context. I've always been an avid gamer. So you can see here, Doom, classic first-person shooter. And I was also, back in academia, research, doing things, like early cave systems. And it's something that's kind of stayed with me today. I throw up this slide. This is Destiny. So I lead a clan in Destiny. So I actually, which is Bungie, they did Halo. So I practice what I preach, and I do kind of know what I'm talking about when it comes to gaming, at least. And so looking at sort of influences from gaming, and it's interesting also to kind of see how the technologies which used to exist at the university research environment level have now filtered more into the mainstream. So things like the headset, mobile dome systems. So these kind of like, I wouldn't call them consumer, but let's call them prosumer sort of mechanisms for 3D and VR. I mean, my first headset, when we were upstairs sort of talking about it, I've got in my studio the first sort of headset with LCDs in there, but they're these really tiny LCDs, and the thing weighs sort of like 10 pounds. And I did sort of experiments on it, but I never brought it into an exhibition, because I was like, this is really not usable, and the tech wasn't ready. So, but, things like working in a mobile dome now. This is a project that I did at the V&A for their digital design weekend. And we got like 2,000 people through the dome in a weekend. So all of a sudden, these things, this was a real-time virtual environment. Or the piece which Mila talked about, New Jerusalem. So this idea of, yes, it's a headset piece, there's projection, there's a soundscape, but it's built on technologies that I was working with, say, 15, 20 years ago, but now they're kind of ready for the mainstream, or ready for kind of like a context like this. So I think that's a lot that has changed. And for me, I often think about this idea of the virtual realities, but also the physical spaces. And that's something that I think is really important because, you probably can't see this, but this is Roman fresco wall painting, cave paintings at Lascaux. So if we think about what VR is, illusion, immersion, most people think of it in the technological age, but I think about it in terms of history. This idea of the projection of the mind into this sort of other space, and it's got architectural components, it's got scenographic components, there's a multisensory component, and there's also a populated component, And all of these spaces were spaces that we lived in, we performed in, we existed in. I think that's something that's really important to me, which is why I don't just do stuff on a headset, I like to do stuff in a physical space. So the show that Mila was talking about that I just had at the British Library, Imaginary Cities, again, that was something that I really thought of is trying to like embrace an environment and bring people into an environment. And yes, the headset component, the VR work, was a big aspect of the show, but it was one aspect of an entire experience. So some parts you see here today. There's a quick little video of that, just so you can get an idea of the show for people. How do we start and full screen this? Media player. Okay. So here you can, just a little 30-second promo clip to give you kind of feel for the whole thing that was there. Yeah, it's on YouTube. So I was asked to come in and work with their digital collections. And as Mila was saying, I used their 1 million images from Scan Books collection because it's this Victorian age historical collection, but that's been brought into the digital age. And I looked at the maps and using the maps to create these experiences, these imaginary cities. So again, this idea of sort of building something that is unique, live, populated. And let's see, Control L, maybe? Ooh, look at that. So really, for me, just kind of a finishing point. So the things that I'm interested in creating are things that are, on one hand, born virtual and also beyond simulation. I'm not interested as an artist producing something, an experience that you could just have in physical space. That just is inherently boring to me. I think of that as something like the digital photocopier. At the end of the day, is just a photocopy. Doesn't matter. I'd rather do it in real life. And then on the other side, I want to take the VR and embrace things that are inherently physical and also non-deterministic. So if we look at sort of some of the limitations of any computational system, it's just like, determinism, it's a predetermined outcome. It's a sort of a closed system. So I like to build things with live data or sort of socially influenced data, things that, the wider public have some kind of input into. So the fact, and just a final little note, so the cityscape for Imaginary Cities New York, which you see here, this is based on a Victorian era map that every day the map is sort of ripped apart algorithmically, stitched back together, but that process of recombination happens according to 3 variables. First, it's my instruction, so think solo-wit, process, and instruction. And then think about the second variable, the progression of time. Time always moves forward, so there's a change there. But then the third thing is that every day there's a server application that records the metadata interactions from the previous day, and those interactions from people all around the world play into the reassembly of that map before it's then resed into 3 dimensions, put in a virtual space, which you can experience. So those are my interests. Anyway. We'll stop there, and I'll pass it over to Allegra.
Hi, should I play the presentation and then I can talk a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to?
I think it's just a question of going to the next, yeah.
Sorry for the computer screen here. All our screens are busy. So to get one more screen for the gallery use, I guess.
Well, to be honest, I can just tell you a bit and then we can watch the video. So I work for a company called Khora Contemporary. I'm art director there. And it was founded in 2016. And it came together as 2 main departments. We have a VR department who produce VR across the spectrum. So for medical applications, healthcare, education, commercial projects. And then the other half of our team come from an arts background and run the Falsko Foundation in Denmark, which is an arts foundation. And it was founded in 2016 with the intention of dedicating itself to the production of contemporary art or virtual reality artworks. And with an in-house team specialized in producing specifically contemporary art in VR, we could do what freelance producers could do, but much faster and to a higher standard and higher quality. And the assumption was that we would produce the works and they would be naturally assimilated into the system, and galleries would go on to sell them and they would be placed in exhibitions. But what we found was that people were unaccustomed to seeing these works in an art setting, and the work didn't happen on its own. Nothing was, no one was approaching us to show the works. So we started to take on the role of a VR art gallery, which means that we actively, place the work in interesting exhibitions, we place it in the best collections, we work to place it in museum shows, and the way that we work is we are approached by artists, or we approach artists, and we curate a program. We produce the work with the artists, and we basically facilitate a dialogue between the developers and the artists to produce the work, with the artist leading the vision. And so that's, and then once the works are produced, as I said, we go on and we place them in collections. The way that the business model works is that we sell the works as editions, as you would a traditional artwork. The market is very much at a nascent stage. If you think about it, commercial headsets have been around for maybe 4 years. I mean, the history of VR goes back to, it goes way back. I mean, people have different timelines for it, but there aren't headsets widely available, and people are not so used to seeing the work, so the collectors are slightly reticent. So what we have found is that we have to subsidize our income by testing out new models of monetizing the work. We're very interested in TeamLab, for example, who have found a way to monetize experiential art through ticketed exhibitions. And we've also been working with museums and private collections to digitize their artworks or digitize exhibitions. But as I said, it's really a working model. So as we go, we're coming up with new ideas of how to generate surplus income to offset the cost of productions. And then I have a small video which kind of shows, it's recorded in Falsko, the Arts Foundation. It shows a bit about how we work.
The main reason for founding Khora Contemporary was to give the artists the opportunity to see what they could create in virtual reality, to challenge this new media.
Art is such an interesting way of working with this new medium to really make something that has never existed before.
I think our first word is passion. We have a close relationship with the artists. We really would like to be that bridge that transfers their vision into VR.
The idea for the artworks is always from the artists, and what's interesting for us is to find out how to translate that with the technology that's available today in the best way possible to bring their vision to life within this new medium.
It's you face to face with this unexpected, artistic, raw reality.
I think the big dream for us would be that there is no such distinction as art and VR art. It would be great to come into a museum or into an exhibition and just see it as another oeuvre in the artist's body of work.
So in the future Khora Contemporary, what I really hope is that we will continue working with groundbreaking artists.
For now, we have only seen a fraction of what can be done.
Allegra, just quickly, how big is the team?
So there are 5 partners who work on the projects part-time, and then I'm running it full-time. And yeah, half from VR, half from art.
Yeah,
Should we switch?
Do you mind if I use that microphone?
Yeah,
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Sylvia Pan from Goldsmiths. I'll be standing up because that's what I'm used to when I teach. So that's the way I think now. So I started VR 2004-05, and this is the very first virtual character I've created. Christina, she's back then the attractive virtual character. And fast forward 2016, this is a photogrammetry of myself. So this is really to show that in the past sort of 10, 20 years, we have really sort of progressed a lot in terms of creating photorealistic looking virtual characters in computer animation, and also in programming the interactivity in VR. So I have no idea what's the next slide. Okay, this one. So talking about VR, majority of people will probably be thinking about something like this, the Oculus Rift device, and kind of gaming experience like this one, Super Hot or Beat Saber, probably the two most popular VR games. If you haven't tried, please do try them, they're amazing. Also, VR art experience, this is from Professor William Latham from Goldsmiths, Mutator Art, again, really amazing piece. But the point I'm trying to make here is also, thanks Michael for mentioning the cave, so I don't have to explain what it is. So this is one of the very early work I've done. Just play the video. If you pay attention to his body, so she made a compliment about his shirt, and he was really enjoying it and sort of made a compliment back. But at the same time, he's enjoying it so much, he's actually sort of swinging his body. And another thing he's doing is that he actually went all the way to the back wall of the cave in order to be closer to this avatar he's talking to. But what he didn't know is that we actually programmed the virtual character to maintain an interpersonal distance. So the more sort of he pushed back, the more the avatar actually stepped back. So, you know, the distance is actually constant in this case. And we also programmed the avatars to be maintaining sort of gaze with this guy as well. So these are sort of the social interactions as computer programmers we really have to pay attention, even that very early stage of VR we're trying to do in order to make that immersive and engaging experience. Another reason why I'm showing these slides is also to try to remind myself of back in the days when we want to make VR experiences like this. It's nothing like what you guys have now here. You just use, you know, one sort of 2,000 pounds computer, you open Unity, you sort of drag some boxes, write a couple of lines of code, and put it here, it all works. Back then, we kind of, I think this system was using like a system called Dive, and also we used like a avatar engine called Piavica, which was like developed in-house, and then the whole thing was run in a cave-like system, which means that there are 4 projectors projecting on the walls, and each projector is run on one machine, and together they are a cluster, so there has to be some kind of way to make sure the clusters are sort of communicating with each other, and then there's a little tracker the participant wears, and that has to go through a different system and then all go back together. So it's like a really big piece of engineering work. And in order to get anything to work, it's really a team of people working together. So it's just really, you know, in the past 10, 20 years, not only that we've got a lot better in computer graphics, but the development time of VR, because of those new devices, has really, you know, become from a couple of years, a huge team, to a couple of months, even a couple of weeks, one individual artist. And I think this has, you know, fantastic implications in all sorts of areas. Actually, there's a slide I put here. So until 2018, you know, we kind of moved on to that cave system. 2015, that's when those devices came out. We had Oculus Rift. It was about, I think, $700-800 when they came out. Also, HTC Vive, $800 again. But all these devices, you will need a 2,000 pounds machine to run them. And this all came out 2015. So what happened this year is that we have Oculus S came out, which is $400 or pounds the same, and which requires a PC, but you got rid of the sensor. So you don't have to sort of hook up the device for this. You plug the headset in the machine and it just works. And also you have Oculus Quest, which is a standalone VR headset. I don't know if you have tried it. It's really going to change the landscape of VR. So, and this is just from 2015 to 2019, 4 years. So what happens in 4 years' time from now? I think this is going to be very interesting devices, and the market we're looking at is going to be totally different. So what's next? Okay, so these are just some of the applications. Let me see if I can, yeah. I've been doing, so, you know, like, the reason why VR as a research in the past 20 years has been going despite the huge amount of, you know, development cost it actually carries is because actually in research we see the potential of VR in social anxiety therapy, psychotherapy, medical doctor training, or neuroscience research. But all this relies on sort of getting that social interaction right in VR. That has been the majority of my work so far. But I think today I want to talk about slightly something different is that, you know, when talking about the link between VR and art, I think it's really, really important to mention that VR is not only just engaged and immersive, it's embodied, right? And so in this embodied, not just that you're using your body to interact in VR, but actually you could exist in VR, you could embody another body in VR, and in VR you can be somebody else. And there are lots of research implications as well. For instance, if you, for Caucasian participants, if we embody them into a dark-skinned avatar, it actually reduces their implicit racial bias. And there are many amazing work along this line as well, and with applications in sort of mental health and all sorts of areas. And in this case, my PhD student, basically used a Kinect device to capture body movement, and she's wearing an Oculus Rift, and she sees the avatar in the mirror, which mirrors her movement. And this is probably the avatar she chose that she thinks represents herself. So in VR, she exists in VR. She has a mirror, she sees her hands. But the next step is really maybe changing the avatar to a different body shape, your different gender, different ethnic group. And that's I think, is going to be amazing applications that you can explore, either in sort of real-world applications or in art. And another thing I really want to mention is this experience I've tried in the US, 2017, I think. It was IEEE VR conference. We were in Los Angeles, and I tried this application where I was inside someone's fMRI data. fMRI's function, sort of MRI data as a brain scan, but not only just the brain structure of the brain, but also the blood flow in it as well. So the way the scientists choose to represent the data is like, I'm in VR, I'm in someone's brain, I see the brain structures, and there's a slide I can grab, and as I drag the slide, it's like a little big plane you have, and so it's just over there, and on the plane, it represents with color the blood flow of that area. So I can actually drag the plane to see the color changes, represents how the blood flow actually changes at different plane of inside the brain scan data. And that just totally kind of changed how I think about our brain, think about neuroscience, and think about, you know, medical research. Just this is really the time makes me appreciate how complex the brain is, and, you know, the neurosurgeons' work as well. So I think this is, you know, it has meanings in sort of implications in how doctors can communicate with each other, with patients, but it also, you know, has this value in terms of how we could experience data in formats like this. But at the same time, you need to remember that also means that experience like that means VR is actually quite invasive because it changes how you perceive things. Could be for the better or could be for the worse. I think this, yes, that was kind of the last slide, but I just want to also add some of the amazing work. Just to justify me being an art gallery, I think I added some of my students' work because I teach Goldsmiths students, and lots of them are really amazing. But the majority of the work I've seen the student kind of come up with are still kind of quite game-based because, you know, it's quite fun, and for sort of 3-5 minutes experience, it's sort of easy to have some game mechanics to make it more interactive. So lots of sort of zombie shooting or Beat Saber type of games. And this one, for instance, you can grab trash from a trash can and throw it at zombies. You know, it just, you know, why not? But in particular, I want to mention this work as well. So it's quite a simple implementation, but basically it's like the students sort of build basic mathematical equations with parameters that's linked to your body, so that when you open your arms, the shape actually deforms or expands. And I really love that experience. So abstract, so simple, yet so immersive, engaging, and just really changes the way I feel about the world after the experience. I think that's all from me.
So in preparation for tonight, I've read a bunch of interesting kind of articles, and one of which was an artsy article written by a journalist and editor, Scott Indrusik. It was in April earlier this year. And the question of collecting VR artwork was tackled, where an outline of objectives were set out, and one of which was basically rethinking the art world scarcity economy. A parallel was drawn to collecting photography, where, as we were discussing it earlier just now, an edition with an artist proof is allocated with, and a high-res image of the work is not available to download or see anywhere online. With VR, this isn't quite the case, or it might be. I mean, we'll obviously have a chat about it now. But there are varying views on this. Kilani Nicole from an LA-based transfer gallery focusing only on new media believes a VR piece is, and I quote, meant to be seen and distributed. That's the nature of the thing. Artists like John Raffman or Matt Colisho, for example, amongst obviously a few others, on the other hand, prefer to stick to more of a traditional route of selling VR, which is what we're trying to kind of do here with an edition. I think the highest edition we have is edition of SIGs, with 1 or 2 artist proofs. So very much treating it as, I guess, an edition piece, but a limited edition as such. So one of the suggestions is to scrap our understanding that scarcity is more valuable, at least when dealing with this medium. Daniel Birnbaum, the founder of Acute Art, one of the leading VR production companies, suggests there might be a development of a new model where the blockchain community will introduce partial or collective ownership of works, often cited as the Spotify model for artwork. Now, what are, I guess, my question to you from your kind of varying, angles and approaches to this? What are our thoughts on this? How should we approach that scarcity, that understanding of scarcity, or the lack of it within this medium? Michael, do you want to kick it off, or from kind of an artist's side?
I can certainly say that I agree with Kalani, because when she was over recently, we were actually chatting about that, and that we both were thinking about in terms of a VR work, or a work, I should say, with a heavy VR component, is of course all about the experience, but it's usually more than just that VR coded element. And as such, she was saying, oh, well, I think you should, one should just actually, when you edition or sell a piece, you sell the whole thing as a package, and however it gets re-realized, so be it. And I said, yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's kind of, as you and I have started thinking about how we might edition my works, like pieces like A New Jerusalem. Certainly, we did it as the the whole package. So I think that kind of brings up one idea that with VR as it exists now, there's not going to be a one size fits all, because there are some pieces which are just a headset piece, and that could behave quite differently, or might follow a different model to, say, work like myself, which is more, I'm embracing, a spatial sort of installation with a heavy VR component. But for me, in the kind of work I'm interested in, certainly I think the kind of editioning from a traditional standpoint, with the added complexities that, of course, VR brings to the table, like about sustainability, digital preservation, making sure that a collector or an institution who buys a work has a reasonable chance of restaging it for a reasonable amount of time. What that amount of time is, how much one goes in terms of being the artist, or say, the gallery, to basically enable the restaging of that work, the duration of that. That's a good question.
When you say restaging, you mean in what way? So kind of have...
Okay, restaging insofar as that, okay, the Imaginary Cities piece, perfect example. It came because the show was extended at the British Library for 2 months since it was so popular. It literally came, these components came straight from the library here. What you would have seen in the library, very different in terms of the space, the context, so on and so forth, to what we have here, even though on paper it's the same work. So, again, I think maybe it's with that, we could take some lessons from artists like Solowit, like how do you buy a Solowit, and what exactly are you buying, you know, in terms of a piece of his, where it's like actually what you're buying is instructions. So here what you're buying is some code, but with some instructions, maybe, for me, maybe some various other elements. And then we also think about, well, what do we do with the source code? Because again, say I have remastered works. I started working in Oculus at the DK2 stage because that was baked enough that it was ready to go prime time. You know, the first development kit with Oculus, half the people that would put it on would just get nauseated. So I wasn't willing to actually put that in a gallery. DK2, it had problems, but it was good enough. So, you know, I did work on DK2. But then when the first commercial release, CV1, the Rift headset comes out, everything I did for DK2 had to be remastered. That could only happen if you had access to the source code.
But just to kind of, so from your end as an artist, are you for or against the idea of basically making the piece either accessible to all, kind of free for all model, or are you more for let's make it an edition work, let's treat it as, you know, like I said, additional 5 or 6
Yes.
plus 2 a piece or whatever it is for a specific price, and this is what it is. So it cannot be featured in any format online, you know, available to, again, a wider audience to plug in and see it, whether through any type of model of headsets or just on a screen or a projection, whatever format they choose to kind of see the work in.
Yeah,
which part of
for
you
my
in?
work, it definitely fits nicely within the kind of the edition with an AP sort of thing. But then again, the kind of work that I produce is not something that just exists on the headset.
No.
So I wouldn't come up here and say, preach that, oh, it has to be this way. Because for artists that are working with more just only a headset component, you could certainly go down sort of larger editions or have some kind of subscription service. You could look to sort of how economic models are done in the gaming industry or in film industry. You know, of course you could. That might fit another practitioner's work. It wouldn't fit my work. You know, at this moment in time, there might be some time where I do actually create a headset-only piece and that I could release that to a mass market environment. I mean, upstairs we were talking about PlayStation 4, you know, back to the gaming. You know, I could create and release a work on the PlayStation Store. Why not? You know, but I think maybe just my ending thought would be whatever an artist decides to do in partnership with either a distribution sort of company like PlayStation or Oculus, or with a gallery like yourselves, that you just have to be upfront, transparent, and hold to your decision. Because it doesn't matter if it's a 50 pound or it's, you know, a 50,000 pound. If you sell something, you know, you make a contract and you hold to it. So I think maybe that's one of the things that we need to think about, not playing fast and loose and kind of going back on our decisions.
It's interesting what you're saying. I think one of the most interesting things about VR is that it's dematerialized, so you could show it in any location. I mean, you know, the fact that exhibitions tour to all the major cities, so many people don't have access to seeing the works. VR enables that. I really believe in a future where the work would be accessible on a streaming platform, and that people could pay for a subscription and ultimately fund the production of these works by essentially collectively owning it. But as we were talking about earlier, the headsets have only been around for about 4 years. They're not widespread, the ownership is not widespread enough to make that lucrative. It's just, I mean, we don't think at this present moment, right now, we could be able to afford funding the productions based on that model, which is why we do sell works quite traditionally as editions. That doesn't stop us from experimenting with new models. And I was talking about how we, you know, we're really interested in ticketed exhibitions as a solution, but I do think that when people consider VR as a medium and why it's so important and why it's important to be, you know, creating work in VR now and collecting work in VR now is because it is at such a nascent stage. And so every single decision that we take at this point has an effect on how VR will be shown, collected, produced in the future. And every exhibition that you choose to put the computer on a plinth with a headset, you choose to set up your installation in a certain way, that will be referenced by artists for years to come, just because artists working now are really the pioneers of this medium. Yeah, I think it's interesting to test around both.
Well, you kind of exhausted almost everything, but just like I really feel, as you said, there's two spectrum. VR doesn't have to be either just in a room or online distribution. It could be location-based VR coexist with online distribution. It's like any VR, just a new medium, right? Is like TV or art or digital art. Lots of people see them at home, but lots of people still go to the cinema or to go to a more interactive experience in an art gallery. So I think VR just another medium. We don't have to define exactly how we perceive it. But I completely agree in terms of actually we sort of set it up in a gallery, how do we monetize from it, how do we actually sell it digitally. It is something that we should start defining on, be actually quite careful in the practice we actually conduct here. And just as a sort of example, I don't know how many of you have seen the Ocean of Air by Marshmallow Laser Feast. So for me, that was like, I think lots of artists should really look at the referencing that piece, because there are lots of things they've done are really different from what I've seen other artists have done, and they've done it really well. And I think they're actually making a profit from putting that exhibition. But what they did is, first of all, it's very technical setup they have, and also it's very interactive. So it's not you're just observing something, you're not passive in that environment, you're really playing a role, you're really sort of actively participating. And not only that, you're there participating on your own, but you're actually having a shared experience with 3 other persons who is in that environment together with you, and that made the whole piece so beautiful. But also in terms of actually the sort of running it, I think they have at least 3 members of staff at there constantly to make sure that this experience is delivered exactly how it's supposed to be, and that obviously costs money, but still they were able to make money because they were selling tickets like £20 or something per person for a 15 minutes experience, right? But another thing I also want to mention is for this kind of location-based VR. I think this piece was really successful also because they're not just using the VR headsets. They had other things hooked up as well. They had a breathing detector, so you can actually blow into the sort of detector, you can see your breath. And I think they put a heart rate monitor on you as well. And if you're a VR developer, you will know it is not that straightforward to get all these things to work together, especially for them to work together beautifully. So I think in terms of location-based VR, it would make sense to have additional sort of hardware on top of the headset as well. That justifies it, really. So because that's then an experience, no matter how the VR market, no matter how cheap the headset will be, people will still go to a place to have access to hardware they otherwise won't have at home.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you were saying. The Marshmallow Laser Feast was fantastic. And for me, one of the most important things what you brought up was the fact that there were invigilators for each person coming through. And a lot of the problems we face when we're showing the work is that people are unfamiliar with it. They don't know how it works. And so they're scared off, or they don't want to invest because they're insecure about the future of the medium just because they're not familiar. And to show it constantly to that caliber, to that, in that way where people inform and teach people how to use the hardware is really important, because the moment that VR becomes interesting is the moment that the hardware becomes irrelevant, where you can just focus on the concept or the artwork itself and not, spend hours worrying about, whether the headset's working or the cue, like all of those logistical problems. Those are the things that really drag the medium down, I think.
Just want to add 2 things on that, because for any gamer, you would know that before you actually play any sort of games with complicated interaction, there's always a little training session you go through to make sure that you know which button means what, right? But actually, another thing that in VR research we kind of constantly, I wouldn't say fighting, but trying to sort of explain is that gamers are very used to programming with the gamepad. And lots of VR developers at the moment actually come from a gaming background. But in VR research, the narrative we have about interaction design is always about, if you want to do something VR, think about how you do that in real life, and how do you capture exactly that in VR so that you don't have to think about it when you actually conduct that action. So in real life, I want to drink some water, I grab this glass and I drink water, and that's how I do it. And in VR, can you exactly represent that? To which degree can you represent that with the existing hardware? Is a question we kind of have to push game developers to solve, because they don't come naturally with the sort of skill set or motivations to solve this kind of problem. But I completely agree with you, like how to sort of reduce the cognitive load and really make the interaction transparent to the users is a really interesting question. Yeah.
So I guess, is it important for us to identify then just a distinction between what a VR work looks like within a museum institutional space? Because I presume the Marshmallow piece was where it was in a museum. At Saatchi, exactly. So a distinction between kind of a piece like that, where it's obviously experience-based and all these kind of different senses are engaged, and it's a public work, you know, aimed to, again, interact with a bigger kind of audience, versus more of an intimate piece, which is, you know, geared towards a one-on-one engagement with a work by the buyer, by the collector, that one would experience within, for example, a commercial gallery setting. I mean, the question is, I guess, would you know, Allegra, I guess for you, is there at any point in your discussion conversations with the artist when you're producing the work, does that become a topic of discussion? Would you advise an artist to say, oh, actually, you know, what's the intention here? Are we looking at obviously releasing it on the market, on selling it or not?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of the artists, as I was saying earlier, really require that the work be openly accessible. That's what they want, and they want it to be something that you can download at home. And yeah, and I suppose part of that is like the democratic aspect of it, the fact that it can be so widely accessible. And then other artists are very particular about how the work is shown, and we have to run everything by them. And to some degree, the question comes back to, you know, art in general. I don't see VR as any different from a painting. Why should a painting be shown in, you know, part of the value of a painting is the fact that it's shown in a certain way, and some would argue that showing it in a museum does add value to the painting. I mean, it's the difference between a print and a painting. Or I don't see why VR work should necessarily be shown in a private setting. I think it's a very performative thing to experience VR, and if you've ever watched anyone in a museum with a headset, part of the experience is watching other people, part of the experience is being in it yourself, and there's a whole interaction that happens that's interesting in itself, and that many artists put a lot of thought into when they're producing the work. How is this going to be experienced, or how are we going to install it?
So I guess from kind of just the collector's point of view, you look at the headset, once you wrap your head around the fact that, you know, you're buying a digital file, I guess that's what we call it, right? A digital file, no offenses. Yep. A digital file with the hardware, headset, computer, and all. Say, you know, I don't have a headset at home, right? I'm one of those, and I walk into a gallery, buy the whole thing, have a price, negotiate the price, done deal, great. That would be easier to wrap my head around versus, you know, oh, there's a fan and there's an invigilator that has to be there every day, and that whole kind of experience base. Yeah. I guess that's the, you know, the importance that we need to maybe identify between the VR works out there, right? If we're talking about the kind of the market and the commercial element of it.
And it's an ongoing discussion. I mean, I think that what you're saying about Sol LeWitt is actually very relevant. Why shouldn't there be, you know, an instruction manual that comes with each work? Where at the moment we work with a company called Archery to digitally certify the works, and when you buy it, the work is signed over to you. But it would be interesting, for example, to find a way to codify these digital certificates to include instruction manuals and, and fix how you present it. Because much like, you know, a Bruce Nauman or a Namjoon Paik, you don't get to choose the hardware on which you show the work. It very much, you know, you show it in the way that it was originally shown in, you know, the 60s or the time it was made. So,
I mean, certainly you could. I can. Now this comes from kind of the opposite side of the commercial sector, but some of my works have been deposited in media archives like the Rose Goldson archive that's held now at Cornell, which will be kept forever. So that's, you know, and it's an open sort of open archive insofar it's not a commercially minded affair. It's definitely sort of collections and sort of has academic connections. And for that, the works, when I put them in, everything, you know, a lot of work went into sort of documenting not only sort of the history of the work, you know, in the provenance, but also from a sort of a computer science standpoint. We spent, myself and my team, we spent a lot of time actually annotating the code and just listing things out semantically, and also for myself as an artist, kind of explicitly stating this is important, this is not important, you know, or giving explanations. Just again, being very transparent with, you know, what we did, why we did it, you know, whether it was a technical reason or a creative reason, or we were sort of like riffing on something that was going on in sort of techno-pop culture at the time. You know, we explained both the hardware and the software, and then also the context, and we provided a lot of documentation as well. So, you know, and I think you could certainly still take aspects of that kind of working process into a more commercial setting, and indeed, I probably would. But that's just, again, that's not because it's some defined code of practice, because as you stated, Mila, there just isn't one right now. But I would do just because for me, it just kind of makes sense. That in a sense, these technological systems, they are performative. They're constantly changing. You know, sometimes I'll even make works that, well, this is a good example. The Imaginary Cities work, it just kind of barely works on the current hardware. You know, it'll probably be I know it'll be much nicer in 2 generations from now of graphics card. It just, you know, it is what it is. You know, so you kind of like build things for the future. But then, of course, you can build it for a near future, but, you know, the medium to far range future you can't anticipate. So you kind of have to be maybe look at preservation strategies of things like performance, where you would actually outline, well, here's what we did, here's why we did it, here's what's important. And if you're going to restage this work sort of 50 years from now when I'm either dead or too old to care, you know, here's what you need to know. You know, I think we could definitely take lessons from, say, the more academic preservation side of sort of media practice and put that into a commercial context, because why not?
Why not? Exactly.
Yeah.
The one thing, I guess, in terms of, now that we touched on it, the preservation element, because I'm conscious of time as well, I'd like to open soon to Q&As. But in terms of preservation, we've had kind of, well, a few experiences where, you know, through selling a work or in the process of selling a VR piece to a private collector, there'll be this kind of slightly awkward discussion between us, the artist, and them, where we're trying to figure out, I guess, responsibilities of each. You know, in, again, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, the hardware is no longer supporting the file or the piece itself, right? Who do they call? Who does the collector call when there is a glitch? You know, is the gallery responsible? Is there a number of years in terms of guarantee that the gallery provides? Is the artist on call when, you know, the collector is having a dinner party and wants to showcase and show off a VR piece to them and it doesn't work, you know? Or, you know, does the collector need to have a bunch of kind of, I guess, techs who are, you know, versed in this whole kind of environment? And it was interesting because at that point it was literally a discussion for the first time. There wasn't a sense kind of authority as you'd expect, you know, in the purchase or acquisition of any other medium or any other artwork, where it's, you know, the gallery sells the piece, it comes with TNCs, whatever it is, you know, you're not allowed to resell it within the 2-year period or whatever the terms are. They're set, which is what we were talking about earlier, there are set norms. And almost kind of a protocol in place, right, that the whole industry is based on. With VR, it hasn't really caught up yet, right, obviously, because there are certain things, as you were mentioning earlier, there's kind of little puzzle, right? That you need to, it's kind of trying to figure out what works. But with the hardware preservation, or with this hardware development, what, I guess, would you, for example, would from a Khora Contemporary side, how would you go about it? Is it something that maybe the VR production company,
yeah, so that's something that
gets
we're
responsibility?
very clear about, that we take full responsibility for the work throughout its, throughout, as long as we're still running, we would, take responsibility for the upkeep or for updating the software to the hardware. But as we were saying earlier, I think that how these pieces are conserved, will unfold over time, because if we take the example of video art from the 60s, it really is still shown on the same hardware that it was produced for at the time of production. And I think that, the temporality of the hardware will add to the charm of the work, will add to, is very intrinsic to the piece. So I'm not sure that people will want to update the software to the newest hardware available in 2040 or whenever. And there will be conservation issues, but these are not things that are exclusive to VR. I think the same applies to painting. Restoration is an ongoing science, and the same applies to video art and sculpture. So I think that we'll have more of a sense as time goes by of how people choose to maintain the works.
Yes, I think, soon enough we'll have Oculus Quest everywhere, and I would imagine an art piece will be like a piece you can see on the Oculus Quest. But at the moment, you have to really, whenever you use something on the Quest, you have to be connected to the Oculus store, and then you kind of get it from there. But I think it's a matter of actually when there's big enough market from the art sector, then you can have this conversation with Oculus or HTC, say, hey, can we actually have this other way of, you can just have this headset and locked it to display one application, and that's it. It's always going to be, as long as its hardware is not broken, you can just switch it on and do that, and that's it. So, because they paid, collectors pay thousands of pounds for this, right? So the hardware cost is actually quite small, and as you said, this preserves the original hardware that the art is designed for anyway, which is probably a better way of presenting it for the future.
And also with each new hardware, there's new features that develop. So I suppose some artworks won't really be relevant in the new hardware, on new hardware.
Yeah, even for like VR game development, so when they make a version of a game, they normally have a sort of 2D for the version as well, but then they have to make a version for Oculus, another version for HTC, another version for PlayStation. So in terms of optimization and the user interaction, it's all different. They have to recode everything, rethink about the kind of HTC design side of things. So I would really think, from an art collector perspective, the application, the piece of art, and the hardware was designed for, they're the same thing. They're, the hardware is part of the art.
Yeah, but then that brings us to the problem that, yes, conservation of hardware, of course, is possible, but unlike a painting where you have, we have long histories, if we look in sort of analog forms of art, how to preserve those. We know how to preserve all this analog stuff. The digital things, we don't know so much, And then if you look at the hardware is actually meant to have a very short lifespan. That headset, that S that I brought, it's only been out a few months, and I just thought, you know what? At the British Library, we were running on the CV1. I've just got this S. It's much better. I've done enough dev to know it's probably going to be fine here. So let's do it because it's a much nicer headset. But that will have a longevity of probably 3 years. And then you just won't be able to buy parts for it. And these things are meant to, because you look at the companies and the reasons, and their sort of business models are predicated on the fact of upgrading. So, you're trying to do something. What we're trying to do here in an art context is actually fighting against what they're trying to do, which is constant upgrading. So, we have to realize, just kind of put that out there and say, this is going to be a problem for us. The other thing, if we're looking at things that are just headset-based, and of course it would be ideal if there was one system, one platform, isn't going to happen anytime soon. Look at the history of gaming. Look at sort of even like Xbox versus PlayStation versus Steam. what is the first thing that is truly cross-platform? Fortnite. Why is that? Because so many people play it. And it has taken millions of people, you know, and billions of pounds to force them to basically allow cross-platform play. You know, VR, not a chance. Not anytime soon. You know, you have to look at sort of other things where, you know, unfortunately, we are beholden to media companies, tech companies that exist on a very different economic mindset than we do here in the art world. So that, I think that's going to be one of our real big challenges, dealing with these issues.
Please.
Sorry, if I may, just picking up.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. Can we actually get the microphone? Can someone help us with that? Sorry, we're just recording it. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry to intrude, but just maybe
but
picking up on this point, which is one of the points I've been thinking about this new medium. So please don't misunderstand. I'm a huge fan of AI, for example, and that's the future, and that's, I think you've been hitting at that as well several times during the conversation. But I'm still somehow occupied and a little haunted by a really primordial question to all of you. How do you conciliate the traditional concept of art in aesthetical terms with this completely new medium with all the consequences, problems, issues, etc., of which this one is really a main one, upgrading, etc., etc., and how to offer, if you find a way of conciliating the two, how to offer the whole thing to a general public, because not everyone is an art expert, and I think we need to make it plausible, both in academia and in the press or in galleries. I think it's really important. A lot of people are very confused. That's what the commercial world is making, at times, huge benefits and at times huge losses from. And so, you know, it's a whole universe right there. And because you're actively producing, that's why I'm asking you this question.
Okay. Well, I think I can start off. It's a very personal question, I think, for an artist, and the way that I try to address that is that everything that I produce, even if it's in a leading edge media, you know, VR, AI, whatever have you, I am working absolutely always, 100% of the time, within the tradition and history of art. So I'm thinking about sort of things in terms of painting, sculpture, photography, installation, video, cinema. You know, I am using languages, I'm using, you know, people's understanding of art history and context to say, okay, you know, this is what has been done, and here's what this particular technology brings new to the creative table. This is a new tool that I'm employing, but I'm doing it within this historical context and reference. And then with that in mind, I try to be very transparent with people. I really have no time for people that work with digital media that want to mystify the technology. For me, it's like, we're gonna be very transparent with what we've done, how we've done it, why we've done it, because actually the systems these days are complicated enough. So those are the kind of two approaches that I take, you know, working within, you know, the historical context with the new technology, and then being transparent with my viewers.
And also just in terms of accessibility, I mean, I do think that VR does speak to large audiences and different kinds of audiences that normally wouldn't be attracted to art. I mean, I have shown the work personally to many children who really relate to the work because they understand the language. It's digital, you know, it's like, it's kind of got this video game aesthetic that they're used to seeing, you know, in games. So I think
That's different. I'm not surprised because children would have no idea about the tradition. They wouldn't know who Raphael was, Duramat, I don't know, you name them, you know. They have no idea of the tradition. I'm talking about more adult public.
I do think also it's interesting in the way that we're working now, in terms of that it's very similar to the studio method of working. I mean, throughout history, artists have led a large studio of people and directed them according to their vision or concept, and that is very much at the heart of what we're doing. We start with the artist's concept, and then really the whole team is led and move forward in the kind of trying to make the idea come alive, or trying with the hope of producing as faithfully as possible the vision of the artist.
So yeah, I'm not an artist myself, but I work with lots of my students are artists wannabe. They obviously know a lot more about art than I do. So they really love the VR module we run at the Goldsmiths, because we teach them the skills, the history, and the psychology of VR. So they learn this new medium, so they can learn different ways to express themselves, and that they really value this. So yeah, they are excited that they can, they're not restricted to the traditional way of expressing themselves. So I really think that's what VR brings on the table, and it also make them sort of think more sort of creatively, think more in a 3D space, which is what real life is. Real life is in 3D, right? So VR actually helps us to, the reason why traditional art, I mean, I'm not an artist, I guess, so something really silly, please forgive me. I think lots of times artists are restricted by the traditional way of expressing themselves, having to have some 3D concept and have to project that on a 2D sort of thing, right? Or when you're doing sculpture, you're limited by the material. But with VR, it's almost like another way to represent real life 3D interaction in 3D with the ability to program in 3D as well. So you're looking at me in a very suspicious way.
I'm not interested in replicating real life. Reality is where you happen to be. And also, I mean, in terms of our social interactions and what is important, always changes with generations. My daughter is now 20. She's at the University of Liverpool doing her major in computer science. And she and her friends, they've all grown up as gamers. They spend just as much time socializing online, either through, everything from video conference to in-game itself, as they do sort of in physical space. And for them, it's the virtual is just as valid as the real. And the things that they want to do in the virtual aren't necessarily the same things that they want to do in the real world. I mean, I'm not interested in, say, working and building, say, something that I could just do better as a physical structure. The reason why I did the piece on the headset there was because it's this procedurally generated, ephemeral, imaginary city that lasts for a day and then just disappears. And it's something that's made off of a piece of history, a map, added to myself as the artist, which is coming up with those sort of soloist instructions, if you will, added to the fact that the CS term, it's perturbed. So my instructions are distorted by the interactions of online visitors to that original collection item every day, which I can't determine. So the fact that, for me, it's poetic that you have this procedurally generated, beautiful city that exists in the context of the aesthetics and the environment that someone like my daughter has grown up with all of her life. It's something new. When I was her age, that could not be done. That was not possible on so many different levels, from the digital collection item to the hardware, the gaming technologies, or even kind of the concept level. So yeah, it's for me, it's all about sort of exploring a new thing. But then right behind, I mean, the other pieces that Mila chose for the show, that's the latest generation of digital print technologies, which is super expensive, on hand gold-gilded board. So again, I wouldn't want to use a virtual technology to realize that because I wanted to play with materiality. So
yeah, I think what's interesting as well to raise here is the parameters on which we judge a good VR work too, which I think is not existing at the moment, right? Because we all, know the famous artists that have been, tried through the history of time, and art history is a kind of a subject, right? So, but in terms of VR, even though it has been around for so long, and there are quite a few artists working, what's interesting is the VR works that make it to the mainstream kind of media where people, whatever papers talk about, are done by artists who have gained recognition in working in traditional media, right? Mostly. I mean, you're right.
Very much.
So that's maybe something. What's quite an interesting thing of, I guess, the times we live in is I don't know when that will happen. I don't know if it's in 10 years' time. We'll be looking back and we'll say, oh, we'll run it off our our fingers, kind of thing. The top 5 or 10 artists that work in VR, these are real. These are the kind of the fathers of VR art, or it will be much sooner or much later. I don't know. But I guess that there's that kind of uncertainty, which is, again, underpinning this whole panel, to be honest, tonight, is that uncertainty which I think not confuses the collectors, but definitely make them hesitant to commit, even if, again, price levels, which we haven't really discussed, but, from 5,000, let's say, to all the way to 100, 150,000 VR works, edition of 6 or whatever, or 20, we said, or 50, right? One of the pieces you're talking about. Anyway, but with a limited edition, it's a big enough range to appeal to a wider collector base, one would assume. But I think there's still that hesitation because, well, the lack of a protocol as such of what we were, I guess, talking about this, the whole evening, the lack of kind of set rules as to, okay, this is how it's working, and this how all the players from the galleries, the dealers, the auction houses, the collectors, the artists, and everyone are kind of, this is the go-to kind of Bible of how things operate within the VR market, art market. That's lacking, that isn't really, set yet. Again, I guess a matter of time, but I guess these things, so the lack of that and the lack of parameters of identifying good works is what the collectors are having, I guess, difficulties with wrapping their minds about. Do we have another? Sorry, Sylvia. Shortage of microphones.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to stick to one. Why not web VR? Why not simplify all of the artworks through the web and just make it more accessible for all hardware?
So technically, at the moment, I think web VR is only supported by A-frame. There's another technical person here, and I don't think Unity port 2. So basically, by web VR, it meant something that can be probably displayed on a browser, right? That's how we have access to that. And I think at the moment, Unity doesn't actually support that. I don't know about Unreal Engine. And A-frame is the only one, but A-frame doesn't have lots of the features, technical features we want. And I think, secondly, a lot of the VR experience very much are sort of dependent on the sort of capacity of the headset. So for instance, how would you see web VR, for instance, with a headset or with a mobile phone? I don't know what kind of experience you have in mind.
Whatever makes it more accessible for the...
Yeah, so the most accessible would be like mobile phone, Google Cardboard. Like everyone can do that. You pay like, I don't know, £5, you get that. But the problem is at the moment, these devices, technically they are 3 degree of freedom tracking, which means that you can look around, but as you shift your body, it doesn't really track that you're shifting your body. And in immersion, like in engagement, that is like an essential component. As VR researchers, I'm sure for artists as well, that's a really important features to have. And all these headsets you see here, they're all high-end VR. They all do 6 degree of freedom tracking. But at the moment, it's not really supported on a phone like that. So that will be probably one of the reasons. You just don't have the same experience if you want to just load the experience on a mobile phone. And for that device, basically everybody can have access to that. It's just the artist's choice whether to upload it on stores that you have access to on that headset or not. Like Steam VR, I think is one of the platforms people can upload, and the creators can choose to either upload it for free or sell it with a price. I don't know exactly the system, but yeah, basically.
Yeah, but my answer to your question would be, first of all, web technologies standards do not exist right now. HTML5 still isn't an accepted IS. That's still not a standard. And again, you're at a lot of the mercy of technology providers and media companies. And then, like Sylvia just said, there's not one device because you can't separate the hardware and the software at this point in time. And you probably never will be able to. And artists tend to look, like working with things that offer the most potential. So I can tell you, I would be willing to place a bet with you that in 10 years' time, the rendering power required for the piece there will not be available on the mobile phone. The only way you might be able to break that is actually by having like sort of what goes beyond 5G, and then the rendering of that procedural city is done in a server somewhere and gets streamed to your mobile phone. But then again, it's not just about sort of the phone. It's like, okay, well, you have sort of the hardware and how your body is interfacing with that hardware. So you have the sort of the wetware, hardware, software kind of triangle, which is a really complicated thing. And there probably won't ever be a one-size-fits-all for that, because things keep developing, and artists, I often say in lectures, artists are not the inventors by and large of technology, but we're often the first kind of adopters of technologies to kind of push them in ways that people don't expect, or the technologies really weren't intended to be used. And that kind of innovative usage, if you will, is always going to be off-piste, and if it's off-piste, you're not going to have a one-size-fits-all.
Yes, and I just add one more point to that. Is not only the experience might be different if it's delivered on different devices, it's also bad experience actually causes nausea in VR. So so we can't just like, oh, this is the VR piece, feel free to view at whatever device. That might actually, lots of people might actually feel sick, and that's probably the last thing any VR developers would want. So there is this reason they want to control it.
I just had a quick question. You mentioned earlier about authentication and how do you track provenance, especially if you're creating several editions of your work. Is there a certain system you use? Is there blockchain technology or other platforms? Oh, yeah. And any, like you as an artist, but also all of you probably know.
So we use a system called Verisart, and yeah. So, but I don't know if you guys, you mentioned.
Verisart was they're doing the same work, but we do use it. Yeah, we verify all our works. We record all the provenance of the works on the blockchain, and we work with a company called Archery who do the same thing as that. Yeah.
Archery, and I wonder, I don't know who else is out there working in this same space. There are quite a few, yeah. Mycenas, that's it, yeah.
Is there any company that you use, or do you?
No. I mean, it would be, I suppose with the things that I'm doing with Mila and Gazelli, we would use Verisart. But the other thing I would do where I would also provide, a printed thing with my signature. Oh, nice. Yeah, probably on very specialist paper, because I'm proper old and analog, and I like material objects,
Exactly, the traditional way, if I may.
Why not? No, exactly. Why not? Why, I'm so tired of people that, you see this in academia all the time, where everyone wants to build a new tool. And I just think it's like, well, we have a lot of interesting tools and mechanisms that already exist, and what I think is far more interesting and efficient at the same time is actually just recombining them in a new and different way. So I'm very happy to, edition my work, sell the executable as an edition, but then also give a really nice, beautiful piece of paper that's printed out, has my artist stamp and my signature. Why not?
Why not? But I'll tell you why not. Because if I bought your work and I have a physical copy of the certificate of authenticity, I lose it, and then in a few years' time I want to resell it. That's providing there's already a secondary market for VR works, because the primary market has already been clearly created. And then they wouldn't accept your work on the auction because of the lack of the COA.
Yeah, but also like if you're storing your, but here's the thing, I mean, if you're storing something wholly digitally, because we are talking about a digital asset, every backup solution can go down and can fail, and you can just lose it. So, you know, nothing is 100% secure, and everything is at some point reliant on care of preservation.
Blockchain is a solution to underpin exactly that problem, right? I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that it is a safe way because you are, you know, the system you use guarantees that you can use that to preserve it.
Okay.
And the HTTP protocol on the internet.
Also, particularly with all these digital files and video art and VR, we face the same problems. And that anytime you're asked to participate in an exhibition, you send a file, and then someone else sends you another file, and then you send a YouTube it, and then you send. I mean, there's no unified platform that allows us to share and.
Wait, what about Neo?
Yeah, Neo. I have some Neo, but again, you know, they're not. I don't think their reach is widespread enough that they can solve the problem, simply because Neo requires that everyone sign up to Neo and all the museums source the work from Neo. So I really support the idea, but again, with files flying around everywhere, we need a way to really entrench the provenance. So blockchain for us has been a wonderful solution because it means that there's verifiable, you know, attributions, and also that just I think collectors can feel safer in a world where the medium is so new that it does feel a lot like...
I think the only thing with blockchain, it's still a new technology and not everyone in the art world fully understands how it works.
Yeah.
That's, I think, but otherwise, yeah, you're completely right.
But I guess it's just a matter of time, right? It has to be. Because the amount of times blockchain gets mentioned in any format, any capacity, on any panel is insane. So
I still don't fully understand it, but yeah, everyone's talking about it.
Yeah, but you understand the kind of the premise of it, right? Yeah, you don't know how it works, but then...
It's like VR art. We need an infrastructure to create a market for it.
Exactly. Yeah, please.
So to come back a little to something that you said earlier about value, I keep thinking of rare VR pieces. Can we speak of pieces that would be rare and could be owned by collectors in the future? And how should those pieces look like? And how do we value a VR piece to be better than another one? And what are your thoughts? Because you said that it's something that we don't know yet, but what are your thoughts, your early thoughts on that?
Exactly. That's exactly why we need a little... So what I suggest we do, generally, kind of going forward to tackle all of this, is to create, which I kind of, you know, mentioned when we were speaking earlier, is create a little consortium of people who are involved in this, in the industry, purely from the art industry, who would comprise from museum curators, who are, again, well-versed in this medium, galleries, advisors, dealers, artists themselves, who have, you know, rather than using it as an experimentative tool, have actually dedicated and are committed to this medium, right? Not exclusively, but are serious about it, let's say. So, because I think it's not one of those things that you can, again, have an authority within the industry on your own, or even with a few people. I think it would require a village to shift things, right? And again, identify good from a bad. But then it just goes down to the kind of traditional question around traditional art: is what is good art from bad art, right? Which is also another thing that always each panel seems to end with this question, which I absolutely hate because it never reaches any answers. But I'm guessing it is subjective, but. What's interesting with this medium is I think it's still a novelty, the whole experience of it. The fact that you don't care how well the environments are built together or the colors that are being used. Not that you don't care, but you kind of take it in because it's all around you, and it's that experience which I guess overrides the quality of it. I think once that, which again I don't know how long this will take, but once that element of it is over and done with, then you'll start thinking, oh, okay, but actually, you know, this has been done in a more primitive way than what, you know, you'll start, I guess, be more, I don't know, what do you guys think? You're more technical.
In terms of measurement, I don't know anything about evaluating art, but in VR it has always been questionnaires measuring immersion or breaking it down into place illusion and plausibility illusion, which is place illusion is illusion that you're somewhere else rather than where you actually are, like to which extent you psychologically accept that. If you ask a set of questions rather than just one, to make sure you're getting the subjective answer for that. And also plausibility illusion is how much of the sort of events happening in VR make you feel that these events are real and they're relating personally to you. So just as a research field, there are lots of questionnaires out there. And also measurements like if there's an event happen in VR, are you going to react them the same way as you do in real life? And we can measure that behaviorally as well. So there are all sorts of things we use in terms of evaluation. And just on the point of how to kind of make kind of art sort of, become more valuable, we were talking about this idea as well, is like, in VR, I think the difference between VR art and art is like art, you kind of observe it, but in VR, you are playing a role you're part of the art. I know Michael might not agree, but I'm very sort of, for most of VR experience, I implement and make sure I have a body for the character who is in VR. So when you look down, you don't just see nothing, you actually see a body of yourself. And I think there's really interesting ways to engage the collectors this way. So when you purchase a VR piece of art, you have the opportunity to talk to the artist and producer to actually make a virtual you in the art, and that therefore is your piece of art, and it gives them another motivation to pay the money. And if you're talking about thousands of pounds they're paying, in order to do this, it's just really a very small development cost that it has, so it's completely achievable.
I think sometimes artists like to play around with the fact that your body doesn't. It's interesting. It's the only place where you're present, but sometimes you don't have a body. And also, what I was going to say, kind of coming back to your point, that you can't judge VR in the same way that you judge traditional media, just because the value of judgment is so different. That VR is a very physical medium, whereas I'd say painting is visual. So the way that artists approach the medium is completely different, and the way that we judge it has to accordingly be different. It was interesting to hear what you were saying about plausibility and immersion.
Okay, I'll completely disagree with that. I think all art, you can judge any piece regardless of medium. Of you look at sort of the concept. Is it a beautiful concept? You look at it. So I believe now we've reached a day and age in art practice that I believe everything should be both well produced, should actually have a conceptual grounding to it. But also, is it, in this day and age, is it socially relevant? Does it actually speak to something that's quite important in sort of, in the social kind of sphere? And if we're looking at technology, that's often about sort of things regarding social big data, and these kind of things that are coming upon us that are actually changing, the sort of the baseline of everyday life. And I think any piece of work, whether you're looking at a painting or looking at a VR work, you can judge along those lines. And then in terms of what will end up being seen to be relevant, I mean, that's going to be future generations that kind of decide that. My work dialogues with artists of the past. And if my work ends up dialoguing with artists of the future, then that means that I'll be remembered. But then that's far past my lifetime, so I just try not, I just don't worry about that,
But is it though? Because again, at the speed of all of this being developed, it could be in, the change that's coming, it could be in your lifetime, could be, within the next, again, 5 years. That's another thing.
Yeah.
It's how quick is this becoming the thing? Not the only thing, but one of the things, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course. And, I mean, certainly digital media in general, not just VR, but has opened up sort of practice to, it's opened up things on a certain level to make things more accessible. But having said that, I will never use the term sort of like democracy when it comes to technology, because absolutely not. Technology is not neutral. Systems, context aren't neutral. I mean, even if what we've been talking about tonight, it's quite clear that, one of the VR pieces referenced, is something that's existing in the Saatchi collection, which has massive support behind it. Most people, most creators will not have access to that, absolutely. And therefore, it predicates what you can do. You know, there is software that is free. There's also software that costs 10,000 pounds a seat, you know. So, you know, yes, you know, there is more possibility for just the average person aspiring to produce art, you know, in this medium, but it's far from democratic or equal. And in terms of how fast it will go, I mean, I think actually I don't think the time periods will change too much, Mila. I think the one thing that we risk, though, is that because technology is moving so fast, we risk actually losing a lot of the stuff that is being made today. You know, both in terms of the ability to restage it, reshow it, but also kind of the context that exists around it. You know, that's a big problem. You know, and I think that's something that I know a lot of people that work in the museum and gallery, you know, sort of like institutional, public institutional sectors sort of are thinking about that. I know academics are certainly thinking about that. And, you know, if we're looking about longevity and provenance, you know, someone like yourself from the commercial sector is thinking about that. And it's one of those things that if we don't address it now, there actually isn't going to be anything to talk about in the 20 years' time.
Well, that's what we're doing now, right? And this is, at the end of this, I'm going to write the little protocol that I'll suggest to the industry. I'll solve this once and for all. We're kind of out of time, but do we have any last, I don't know, 1, 2 questions?
I think he's been raising his arm.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see it.
Sorry for taking the spotlight. I'm quite interested about you guys talking about how an artist can keep their work, how you can make a work and know it's, say, for example, original, or how do you deal with reproducibility. I don't know enough about art or technology, but I wondered whether there's a technical solution for that. So, for example, let's say creating your source code where as soon as it's reproduced past a certain number, it changes slightly. So, for example, with a painting, you probably have experts that know certain details that only a specific artist could have done. So to the average untrained eye, they see the same work, but really with VR, it's all about detail, it's all about experience, it's all about that extra little bit. So maybe it looks all the same, but maybe there are certain details like a crest or a feel that would be different. My question that I think is much more important is that as technology improves and the abilities of artists start to spread, will VR be something like pieces of artwork on a gallery wall, or will it become more like film that's much more interactive, that becomes a lot more immersive? Will it just explode way beyond a gallery, and will it be a lot more liberated for the mass market rather than for a much smaller niche market?
I think, I mean, there's been this kind of demand for experiential art that's really quite overwhelming. You see it with museums that really want to show this new type of work because it does bring in new audiences and it does attract people to, you know, museums or institutions, but it's not limited to these places. I think what's really interesting about VR is that it kind of crosses over into film and into music, and it engages the senses much in the way that other disciplines do. So we end up showing the work in venues that are quite out of the ordinary for us. So we participate in a lot of film festivals and a lot of tech festivals. So I think that definitely, you know, and, you know, as you were saying, people are already thinking about subscription models and streaming the work. So I think as the medium advances, you'll see it's being shown in different ways than we're used to.
I think I want to answer the first part of the question about, like, you know, artists, when they make paintings, they might use different techniques. Actually, in VR is a very interesting question because, as you said, you have artists together, working together with developers. Right, you have, like, you know, this team of people working together creating a VR work. And in terms of sort of technical details, for instance, in VR, there is shader, which is how materials actually interact with lights, and that's actually, sometimes you can use the default one, or you can program that, and for that you really need to be a computer programmer and know the math and everything in order to do that. And Michael does generative VR as well, and that's just like really program intensive. But And also, when you look at animation, right? I mean, lots of film and game companies, you have something called technical artists. So they are people who are really good at sort of using the technology, but they're actually artists. They design their own animation. They wouldn't let somebody else take that creative process away from them. They want to do it frame by frame because they know exactly how they want each frame to be, or they define a keyframe and get their assistant to do the sort of in-betweens. And then the third aspect will be the actual interactivity. How do you exactly program that, and how do you optimize that experience? How do you make sure that the same maybe interactivity can be programmed in different ways that maybe if you're not so good, then you need an Oculus Rift S to run your application. But if you're better at actually programming that, your program is more optimized, then you can run that application on a mobile phone. So these will be the kind of, threshold that different artists will have different approaches. But maybe they're no longer just artists. There will be a team of people, artists, developers, or maybe someone who can do both, which I think will be the one who define, who will be closer in defining the future of this field as we see in game and film development.
I think we have to ensure that it develops and kind of grows within both the not private, but more of a kind of intimate, as we said earlier, one-on-one spaces, commercial settings as a gallery, art gallery, and then also those that are, in museums, in film festivals, and that are more kind of accessible for, whether you pay for a ticket to experience it, or it's a free event that you kind of get, experience it in whatever the commercial kind of model is. So what's interesting actually is Pace, this was whenever it was, about a month ago now, or maybe a few weeks ago, Pace has opened the gallery opened this department, I guess, or like an initiative called PaceX, which is basically supporting initiatives that are, in between the art and the technology, right? So clearly VR is part of it, but I think it's also just immersive-based experiences, whatever that is, whether it's, Team Lab, as you were mentioning earlier, you walk into your room, whether it's screen-based, whatever the format is. And what was interesting was that I think their business model is that it most of the times would be ticketed. And we had that discussion with actually one of the dealer who deals with VR works, and they were completely against, but kind of quite aggressively against this idea of reducing the artwork to a ticket of whatever it is, £10, £15, £20, £100. But it's that idea of reducing the value of the work, which is however you price it, but it wouldn't be at a £10 level. So I think there's still, and there will be probably these different two schools of thought, right? Making it, again, open, accessible, not necessarily free for all, but having a nominal fee attached to the experience of that artwork. And then those that would be more, again, from that traditional background. And I think it's crucial to keep both, but have that distinct, have a certain kind of, again, a protocol in place where there's a clear distinction. And from the collector side, and they know that, they're not confused by these two different mediums in a way, or experiences existing within the same medium. I don't know if that makes sense, but does it?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me, because the fact is that you look at other forms of art and you have different models of support. I mean, the one thing that's common for any kind of creative production, if we're talking about visual art, is that someone has to provide the resources to do that. And in other sort of areas in visual art, we have different models that are accepted. Right now, we just don't have them really for VR. They're starting to emerge. And whether that's coming out from, say, like a high-end one-off, I want to commission this experience, and I'm a private collector or I'm a museum institution, versus something that, you could, the other end, it could be crowdfunded. Fine. It could be released open source. It doesn't need to be, they're not mutually exclusive, but the one thing that they do share in common is that, you for the production of art, you have to have some kind of economic resource support. So it's actually maybe just kind of, coming up and putting these things on the table and allowing that just to become, part of accepted practice, to say, okay, well, it isn't one size fits all. We have this range of types of things that deal with VR, and this is how they can be supported.
Are we up for one more question? Because I know we had one more question there. Are you still up for it? Yeah, exactly. Okay, never mind that. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.